Hey, well, good morning. So glad to see all of you guys today. We are going to be looking at today a document that I've uploaded called Nationalism and Unification in Europe. And so our goal today is we're going to talk a little bit now that we've talked about the American Revolution, we've talked about the French Revolution, we've talked also about the Haitian Revolution. We're now going to talk a little bit about a little bit more about the roles of revolution in regards to Europe. So while we're still waiting for a couple people to get on, let's do a little coronavirus update. So last night was a significant update for the United States. Not a good one, because yesterday the United States actually became the country with the most coronavirus confirmed cases in the world. We have in the United States 85,762 confirmed cases of coronavirus. That puts us ahead of China, which has 81,000. That also puts us ahead of Italy with 80,000. So far, in regards to death, it looks like Italy leads the world with some 8,215 deaths in the world. Spain has 4,858 deaths, and China 3,292. Here in the United States, our country has 1,306 deaths due to coronavirus. So that's just something to think about as we continue to figure out what kind of limitations we should put on our society. We continue to figure out what kind of restrictions we should, if this lockdown is working and it's worth pursuing. So we'll just continue to see how all that plays out. Now, for us this morning, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be talking about nationalism and unification in Europe. And I've uploaded actually a document that has this Word document and Teams. And this document has, among other things, a couple of maps I want to make reference to, a couple of maps I want you to look at. And one of the first maps is this weird map of Italy. Now, we're familiar with Italy. Even if you don't know geography really well, you've seen a map of Italy, it looks like this boot country. But the thing about Italy is kind of a new thing. Now, we've talked about the Roman Empire before. We've talked about what that has meant for Western Europe as they conquered and they beat up and they took over Western Europe. But after the fall of Rome, Italy kind of fragments and Italy kind of divides up. And so we see that Italy in the year 1815 doesn't look a lot like Italy that we see today. In fact, this map that I've uploaded on this document, it looks like there's 6 or 7 different countries that make up what we would call modern day Italy. There's a country called Sardinia. There's a country called the Two Sicilies. There's a country called Tuscany. So the thing about Italy that we know today is the Italy we know today did not always exist. In fact, the Italy that we know today comes into existence because of a word that we've talked about in the past and that we're going to talk about today, a word called nationalism. This word called nationalism. So this map of Italy on the document, and it looks very different than anything we've ever seen before. Now, there's a second map on the document of another place that we've talked a little bit about before. This part of the world that we've talked about before is Germany. Now, Germany is also a place that hasn't always existed the way that we think about Germany existing. In fact, we've talked about Germany before, and we've called Germany the Holy Roman Empire. That's what we've talked about it as before. We've making a reference to what we call the Holy Roman Empire. And we know that the Holy Roman Empire, when we've mentioned it in the past, it's not really an empire. It's really just a loose confederation of German-speaking states. And that loose confederation of German-speaking states, they're all working together because of some of these common linguistic and cultural similarities. Now, the thing about the Holy Roman Empire is that this Holy Roman Empire was just really kind of loosely put together. And the second map on your document, which is on the Teams page for every class, is you see different parts of Germany that we don't refer to, we don't talk about today. And one of those parts is this part on the map. If you look at it, there's a part of the map called Prussia. We don't talk about Prussia. We don't hear about Prussia because Prussia's not a thing. All these different regions on that map, they're all German-speaking regions. And we're going to see that just like Italy comes into existence in the 1800s, we're also going to see that Germany, for the first time, comes truly into existence in the 1800s as well. So if we see that nationalism, this word nationalism, was this intense pride in your identity, intense pride in your country. Nationalism pulls countries together that have never existed before. Nationalism, it creates Italy for the first time. Nationalism, it creates Germany for the very first time. But nationalism is also going to threaten to tear countries apart. There's a third map that I've posted on the Word document. And this third map is a ethnic map of Russia. Now, if you look at this ethnic map of Russia, everything in pink on this map, everything in that red or whatever you want to call that in this map, it's ethnic Russians. And if you think about that, Russians, ethnic white Russians that you and I can think about when we think about Russia, they don't make up, as far as like all the territory, they don't cover all of the territory of Russia. We've talked about this before. Nationalism and Unification in Europe is the last document that we're looking at. And white European Russians, they don't make up all of the territory of modern day Russia. There's a lot of ethnic groups. There's Central Asians. There are various Muslim groups that are represented, particularly in the southern part of Russia. And nationalism for people living in the boundaries of the Russian Empire could really, really, really threaten to tear Russia apart. And that's why we're going to see that Russia from time to time is going to target ethnic minorities in their country. Sadly, one of the most commonly targeted ethnic minority in the Russian Empire is going to be the Jews. Just last night, my family and I, we took 3 days actually in a row to watch one of our favorite musicals, which is Fiddler on the Roof. So I don't know if you've seen Fiddler on the Roof before. LaPorte High School actually did that musical about 10 years ago, but it's one of my favorite musicals, and it's about Jews living in modern day Russia. Jews living in Russia in the 1800s. And Jews were persecuted, even though they had lived in Russia for a long amount of time, for hundreds of years. Jewish populations in Russia, they were singled out, they were treated poorly, they were persecuted. And this is one of the ways that Russia is going to deal with challenging times. Russia is going to persecute their minorities, and the Jews are going to be one of those minorities. This is an example of anti-Semitism. And so, if you have time during Corona quarantine, I'd encourage you, check out the musical Fiddler on the Roof. Now, we come now to the first line of content that we have on our handout, Nationalism and Unification in Europe. And the first line, it says that nationalism, or a sense of pride in your country, it increased throughout the 19th century. This is something that increases throughout the 19th century. People are more and more going to be proud of their ethnic background, of their ethnic heritage. And this pride is only going to increase as we see the 19th century progressing. So nationalism is on the rise in the 19th century. This is something that we see more and more people are beginning to embrace, and more people are beginning to accept. Nationalism is on the rise for sure. So we have nationalism, we're going to see, is going to help to not only bring countries together like Italy and Germany that we have mentioned, we've talked about. But nationalism is also going to tear people apart. It says here nationalism was a sense of pride in your country, and it increased throughout the 19th century in Europe. And nationalism, it says on the handout, would bring nations like Germany and France together. It would bring unity to nations like Germany and France together. So that's, a positive part of nationalism, is that nationalism is going to bring Europe, in two cases like Germany and Italy, together for the first time. But nationalism in other areas would actually threaten to tear it apart. And the two examples that we're going to give for the tearing apart because of nationalism is going to be Austria and Russia. Austria and Russia. In fact, I want you to take a look at your map. There are two maps of two empires that are worth looking at, and Russia is one of the ones that we just talked about. Now, Russia is an area that we're going to see is going to possibly be torn apart because of nationalism. We see all these different colors, all these different regions, and that can be a really dangerous thing. And the second empire that is going to be torn apart by nationalism is Austria. Austria is also listed. I have a map on the Word document, which is multicolored. There's pink, there's green, there's all these different things. There's yellow. And Austria is also an empire that, because it's so diverse, it's so big, there's so many different areas, that nationalism is going to threaten to tear it apart as well. So we have nationalism, a sense of pride that is increasing throughout the 19th century in Europe. We have nationalism would bring some countries together like France, Germany, and nationalism in other areas would tear areas apart like Austria and Russia, two areas that we'll see. Now, also, there's another reason why nationalism is going to increase in the 19th century, and it has to do with a man who conquered a lot of Europe. If you ever get defeated, if you ever get beat up by someone, you might have a sense of, well, we want to be on our own. We didn't value our freedom before. We didn't value our independence in the same way as we do after having a loss. And there was a guy in the 1800s that you should know that conquered much of Europe. And that French general who conquered most of Europe, of course, is Napoleon Bonaparte. And so after Napoleon Bonaparte, he's been defeated. After Napoleon has been kicked out, now there's this increased sense of nationalism, this increased sense of pride that is now being experienced by people in Spain, people in Italy, people in Austria, different regions. After we kicked out Napoleon, we now have a sense of pride in our national identity. And so local pride increased after the occupation of much of Europe under Napoleon. Napoleon's gone now. And so now we are experiencing afresh and anew a sense of pride. Well, let's look at our first example of unification. And so the first example we want to talk about today is Italy. And it says on your handout that Italy was divided among small, independent kingdoms. That was true of Italy originally. In fact, when you look at the map, Italy was dependent on small, independent kingdoms. And, there were these countries that never existed. They don't exist in our modern world, like countries like Sardinia, countries like the Papal States. There was actually a country, a relatively large country controlled by the Pope. That's what Italy looked like originally. It was divided among small independent kingdoms. And one of these kingdoms, it says on the handout, included the Papal States, which was a country run by the Pope. And if you look at, the world today, there still is a country run by the Pope. And that small country run by the Pope today, it's not called the Papal States anymore. It's called, you probably know this, it's the smallest country in the world. It's called Vatican City. And so Vatican City is still this country ruled and run by the Pope. And so we see these different regions that come together and come unified in Italy. And we still have a little bit of leftovers of this idea of pre-Italian unification, because still to this day in Rome, there is an independent country in Rome that the Catholic Church runs and rules. It's called Vatican City. Now, the second country that gets united at this time is Germany. And it says of this handout of the various German states, there's a lot of different regions that spoke German. And it says of all the various states, Prussia was the military leader. Prussia was the military leader. That Prussia was like the country that everyone looked at and said, wow, you guys are the best. You guys are the strongest. And that was true. Germany was Prussia was a leader in military strength. And so it shouldn't be surprising that this theme of Germany as a rising military strength is going to be something that we should watch out for, because it's going to help contribute to World War I being a thing. It's going to help contribute to World War II being a thing. Prussia as a military leader. There's a guy you should know by name that helps to bring Germany together, and that is this guy named Otto von Bismarck. And it says on a handout that he led to the militarization of Germany. That means focusing Germany's army, the need to build up, to become strong. He led to the militarization of Germany with victories in various wars. And so Prussia, and by extension, Germany, begins to flex its might. We haven't really talked about Germany in a while. We've talked about France, we talked about Britain. But after Napoleon, the power of France is on the decline. China and the British get involved in Africa and Australia. After our Revolutionary War, the British reorient away from looking at fighting in North America to other areas instead. And so on our handout, it says that one of the wars you should know by name that the British, that the Prussians did well in, was called the Franco-Prussian War. And you can imagine, if you think about the Franco-Prussian War, you can imagine that this war is between the Prussians and then the French. And this, it says on your handout, was a quick victory for Germany. In fact, this war, it lists a year, 1870. It starts and ends in 1870. This is a quick victory for Germany. The reason why they fought this war, it says on the handout, is that the Prussians, the Germans, coming together, becoming unified, they wanted to control a region called Alsace and Lorraine. And this was an area which was on the border of France and Germany. Now, this area, which was on the border of France and Germany, called Alsace and Lorraine, it was actually in France, but the language that the people spoke there in Alsace-Lorraine was German. And so in this time of nationalism, people began to think about, well, what does it mean to be German? Or what does it mean to be French? And what does it mean that if I live in France, Alsace and Lorraine, but I speak German every day, maybe I shouldn't really be in France. And from Germany's mindset, they look at the map of Europe and say, anywhere that speaks German probably should be part of a German fatherland. Any part of the map that speaks German should probably be part of a united German empire. And so think about that as the rule. I mean, think about whole regions of the border between the United States and Mexico where people speak Spanish every day, where people may not even speak English. What if we start redefining borders and boundaries based on the language that people speak alone, and say that to speak a language means that you should be part of that country? Well, that's what people looked at here. And the Germans looked at this part of neighboring France called Alsace-Lorraine and said, they speak German there every day. They belong as part of the German Empire. So they invade and they go to war with France. France not prepared to do well, and France very quickly is defeated, and France surrenders. By the way, this is going to be the first of 3 wars in a row that France will be invaded by Germany and lose to Germany. They'll be invaded, and the Franco-Prussian War quickly get defeated. They'll be invaded and quickly get defeated by Germany, and invaded quickly And they do poorly initially against Germany in World War I, and then they are invaded and taken over by Germany in World War II. It says on the handout that Germany saw this, that the border region here in France was in France, but they spoke German. This border region was in France, but they spoke German, and Germany saw this as evidence that they should be part of Germany. They thought that because they speak German in Alsace-Lorraine, that this region of France belonged by natural rights to be part of Germany. And this is the role that nationalism plays. They're looking all around the map for areas to bring in part of the German Empire. And after a quick defeat of France, Germany declares what's called the Second Reich. And that word Second Reich means Second Empire. They declared the Second Reich. And so if this is now like Germany's second empire, well, where's the first empire? Where's the first time that Germany has been kind of loosely put together in into a regional power? And the First Reich, the first empire, would have been an empire that we've already talked about before, an empire that goes all the way to the Middle Ages, and that's the Holy Roman Empire. So we have, after a quick defeat of France, Germany declared the Second Reich, or the Second Empire. The First Reich had been the Holy Roman Empire. Now, that expression, a Reich, or a rule, or an empire, you probably have heard of something called the Third Reich, because we have the First Reich, the Holy Roman Empire, the first rule, the first empire. We have the Second Reich, which is this new Germany that has come onto the map for the first time. And we also have this Third Reich that will later be declared. And people, when they talked about this Third Reich, they said it would last 1,000 years. And you might know that this Third Reich was later declared by a guy named Adolf Hitler. That's who Hitler, that's what Hitler said. Hitler said that Germany, he was just restoring the glory of Germany in World War II. So we have this First Reich, this first golden age of German rule during the Holy Roman Empire. We have the Second Reich right here at this time under Otto von Bismarck, where they're beating up the neighbors, where they're gaining control of areas that speak German, the Second Reich. And then later, Adolf Hitler says that it's his job and his role to create a Third Reich, a third rule, a third empire that for Hitler, he thought would last 1,000 years. So global consequences. What are some consequences of Italy coming together for the first time? What are some global consequences of Germany coming together for the first time? Well, it says poverty. Poverty in unified Italy, it turns out, was more common in the southern part than the northern part. Even though Italy is one nation, Italy is still very different culturally, ethnically, and economically. And the southern part of Italy tended to be relatively darker skin than the far northern part. And the southern part also tended to experience more poverty. And because there is more poverty in the southern part, it's the people in the south that are going to start mass migration to two parts of the world, the United States and Germany. There's going to be mass migration in the late 1800s out of Italy, out of this newly unified Italy, to two countries, Argentina and the United States. Think about Italians in the United States. There's a lot of references to Italian Americans in our culture. You know, you have movies like The Godfather. You have movies that kind of focus on this idea of like mobster mentality and Italian culture. You also have like sitcoms, TV shows. Like there was a show called Everyone Loves Raymond, which focuses on this idea of Italian background, Italian ethnic culture in the United States. And what about that? Well, look at the handout. It says there are over in the United States today 15 million people in the United States today who identify themselves as Italian Americans. 15 million of us identify as Italian Americans, and they make up about 6% of the population of the United States. And so that's not an insignificant number. 15 million Americans trace themselves back to Italian heritage, and 6% of the Americans in our country today have some sort of Italian background and heritage. What about Argentina, though? Argentina does a whole lot more in attracting Italians there. In fact, it says on the handout that it's estimated that 30 million Argentinians have some degree of Italian ancestry. 30 million Argentinians do. That makes up about 62% of the country. So that's kind of an interesting thing, and we'll talk about Argentina more later as we get there. But that's when we think about Argentina is one of the whitest of all the Latin American countries. And one of the reasons that's one of the whitest of the Latin American countries is Argentina has huge migrations from places like Italy and places like Germany. Argentina has one of the lowest levels of mestizos, of mixed race, dark brown skinned people, because Argentina is a lot like the United States in that in the 1800s, the United States was a magnet for Europeans. And in the 1800s, Argentina was a magnet for Europeans. And so Argentina is a lot more European looking ethnically than Guatemala, which I think we talked about yesterday, that like 40% of Guatemalans speak a second language other than Spanish. They speak like an ethnic language. So we see a lot of this. We see a lot of mass migration to the United States and Argentina. And we also see huge percentages of Italians going to Argentina, dwarfing the amount of Italians coming to the United States. 6% of the United States is Italian background. 62.5% of Argentinians have some ethnic background. Okay, so next we have another section called Balkan nationalism. And so you have this huge region of southeastern Europe called the Balkans, the Balkan Peninsula. And the Balkan Peninsula, we've mentioned before, there's a group of non-Europeans that come in and take over the Balkans, and that's the Ottoman Empire. And you might remember that the Ottoman Empire is led by an ethnic group of people called the Turks. And we've mentioned the Turks before, and we've said that these Turks, they've come in and they've conquered, and they've also enslaved various groups of Christians in the Balkan Peninsula. We've said that there's a practice of slavery where they take Christian kids and they enslave them, and they bring them into Muslim households. We call these Christian slaves janissaries. And so on the map, on your handout of Balkan nationalism, we have, again, multiple colors of the Balkan Peninsula. We have Greeks, Romanians, Bulgarians, all these different groups of people. And if nationalism helped bring Germany and Italy together, nationalism is going to also help to tear the Balkan Peninsula away from the Ottoman Empire. Because guess what? Bulgarians and Greeks and Romanians, they're going to also have a renewed sense of pride and independence. And they, in the 1800s, are going to pursue independence. So nationalism that brought Italy and Germany together, nationalism is going to be a factor that's going to tear this Ottoman Empire apart. We also have this map of Europe in 1914. You can see that there's a bunch of new countries that have never existed because of nationalism. Countries like Romania, countries like Bulgaria, countries like Greece and Serbia. These are all brand new countries. So the map in the 1800s is this ever-changing map, and we can see that as a result of nationalism. So the first line in this next section about the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire was the dominant force in southeastern Europe. The Muslims who ran and ruled the Ottoman Empire, this Ottoman Empire was the dominant force in southeastern Europe. They had conquered, they had invaded. Europeans were really freaked out and concerned. And because if you think about it, there was a time that Muslims had conquered and invaded the Iberian Peninsula. You might remember they got all the way into France, and they were defeated at the Battle of Tours in the year 711 by a leader named Charles the Hammer Martel. And then the Muslims, they stuck around and they controlled huge parts of the Iberian Peninsula until finally Muslims were kicked out of Spain and Portugal in 1492. Well, after that Reconquista, that reconquering of southwestern Europe was complete, at that same time, Muslims, represented by the Ottoman Empire, were going into southeastern Europe. And as they lost control of the Iberian Peninsula, they are growing in power in the Balkan Peninsula. And so the Ottomans had been the number one power and control there. That's where we saw the Janissaries. We see Europeans really worried about the power of this Muslim empire to their east. But after the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire experienced hundreds of years of slow decline. Hundreds of years of slow decline. Little by little, parts of the Ottoman Empire are breaking off. Little by little, the Ottoman Empire is being defeated by Europe. And actually, the Ottoman Empire is going to earn a nickname. They're going to be called the sick man of Europe, because a lot of the Ottoman Empire is in Europe. But while other parts of Europe are growing in strength and power, Germany being a good example, Britain being a good example, Russia trying to be an example of a country growing in strength and modernization and power, the Ottomans more and more are going to be beat up by Europeans. The Ottomans more and more are going to be defeated by Europeans and out-modernized by Europeans. And so the Ottoman Empire earns this nickname as the sick man of Europe. It says Europeans, once conquered by the Ottomans, wanted independence after being exposed to ideas of the Enlightenment. And so the Enlightenment, again, is another example that the Enlightenment continues. We've seen the Enlightenment inspires the American Revolution. The Enlightenment inspires the French Revolution. The Enlightenment inspires the Haitian Revolution. It inspires Latin American revolutions with guys like Simón Bolívar. And now even the ideas of the Enlightenment are working its way in southeastern Europe, that these countries want their freedom as well. It says there was one area in particular that Europeans were interested in helping out by sending people to go fight, helping out by sending funds, helping out by supporting. And it says that one of the regions that Western Europeans wanted to liberate was Greece. Greece was a part of the Ottoman Empire that Europeans wanted to rally around, the Europeans wanted to support, that they wanted to help get their independence. And why was it that Greece became like this fan favorite of Western Europeans? Well, it says that Greece gained the interest of Western Europe because it was seen as the birthplace of Western civilization. It was seen as the birthplace of Western civilization, that Europeans looked to Greece and said, well, Greece gave us these great philosophers like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. Greece gave us the ideas of democracy, even if it was imperfect. You might remember that the word democracy itself is a Greek word. The word demos means people. It's rule by the people. Now, for ancient Greeks, they were a civilization that had more slaves than free. For ancient Greece, you had a very limited amount of people that could actually vote. But this idea of voting, this idea of participation of the people ruling, democracy was a Greek idea. The Greeks gave us Greek thought and philosophy, which was super influential, even being rediscovered in a time period that we called the Renaissance, this rediscovery of Greek and Roman thought. And so they thought, you know who we should probably help and support regain their independence? We should help the very region, the very people that birthed Western civilization. And so they start to look at supporting Greece. It says on the handout that Greek nationalism led to an independence movement against the Ottoman Empire that was ruled by the Turks. That all these different empires, all these different regions have groups of people that rule, and the Ottoman Empire was ruled by an ethnic group of people called the Turks. The British, the French, and the Russians helped defeat the Ottoman empires by helping Greeks gain independence in the year 1827. And so Greece becomes a country in 1827. It's a new thing. Russia, we've talked about Russia before. Russia's kind of always been backwards compared to the rest of Europe. We've talked about Russia, that Russia under Peter the Great tried to modernize Russia. And we've talked about that Russia, compared to the rest of Europe, is a little bit behind the times. A guy named Peter the Great tried to bring Russia into the modern era by having his men ordered to shave their beards, by moving the capital from Moscow to a new place called St. Petersburg. And there's a reason why the Russians are willing to help the Greeks. And what is a religious reason? It says on the handout, Russians helped the Greeks because they were both Orthodox Christians. This is one of the reasons why Russia is different from the rest of Europe, that the rest of Europe are Protestant or Catholic, but not Russia. Russia are Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Christians, and that is something they have in common with Greece, and they see this as a reason why they can work together. But there's a second reason why the Russians are okay helping the Greeks in fighting the Ottomans, and this has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with just practical reality. You might remember that there's a problem that Russia has. All the growing powers of the world, powers like France, powers like Britain, powers like the Netherlands, powers like Spain and Portugal, they are growing into sea-based empires. But there's something that keeps Russia from becoming a sea-based empire. It's that even though Russia has hundreds of miles of coastline, you know what's true of those hundreds of miles of coastline? It's frozen. That they have like the Arctic Ocean. And so Russia is always looking for a warm water port. But there's few to be found. That's one reason they go to war with their neighbors, take over the access to the Baltic Sea. They move the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg. It becomes like a window to the west that they can access the west through the Baltic Sea, but they're also looking to the southwest. And it turns out there's this huge body of water called the Black Sea. And the Black Sea is controlled by the Ottomans. So if they can fight, if they can defeat the Ottoman Empire, they can gain access to the Black Sea. Russia was willing to fight the Ottoman Empire because the Ottomans had the Black Sea. And Russia was in need of a warm water port. That's one of the reasons why they're willing to go to war here. It says on the handout that Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania would also gain their independence. So we have one last area of nationalism to look at, and that is within the Ottoman Empire itself. The Ottoman Empire is in decline. The Ottoman Empire isn't doing so hot in the 1800s, and the Ottoman Empire is also a multi-ethnic empire. You have Arabs, you have Jews, you have Greeks, you have all these different areas, ethnic groups, religious groups, and these areas are going to want to bail on the Ottoman Empire. It says, not wanting to fall far behind Europe, Ottomans began to embrace modernization. They began to realize that they need to be more like France, more like Germany, if they don't want to fall apart. They embraced modernization, and they wanted to minimize the role of other ethnic groups. There's one ethnic group that dominates and rules the Ottoman Empire, and that are the Ottoman Turks. They don't want other ethnic groups to thrive and do well. There is one ethnic group that we can look at as a model who are discriminated against, and those are the Kurds. The Kurds were a widely discriminated against group. The Kurds live in the Ottoman Empire, but they speak a different language. The Kurds live in the Ottoman Empire, but they have a different culture. And because of that, the Kurds are singled out and discriminated against. And even to this day, in modern day Turkey, Kurds are discriminated against. Kurds actually want their independence and they want their freedom. Kurds are a prime example of a group of people who are singled out and discriminated against. Even to this day, the Kurds are. So what is the Ottoman Empire going to do if they want to create a sense of unity? Well, they decide to use their public school system to do that. It says schools taught a standard curriculum, created a state-sponsored culture. They want a state-sponsored culture because they think that if the government runs the schools, we can push and we can force the values that we have as a culture. If it's going to be all in one language, if it's all going to be focusing on a certain set of heroes. And that's why actually public education is super influential and important in forming the ideas and mindsets of a culture. It used to be, even in our culture today, we stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. This shows that we value as a culture elements of patriotism, elements of American democracy. We require our schools teach certain things about the Declaration, about the Constitution, about certain heroes in American history get taught. Our public education pushes certain values that our culture has on students. When I was in school, I remember that we actually played the national anthem before school, the whole national anthem, because that was something that we valued. In the 1950s, in the middle of the Cold War, we would have teacher-led prayer or principal-led prayer in schools, because in the 1950s, in the Cold War, our big rival was the Soviet Union, an atheist empire of communism. And so to distinguish us from them, we opened our school in prayer even more so. In the middle of the Cold War, we put on our coins, on our money, the words, "In God we trust." We did that because we had certain cultural values we wanted to push in the Cold War, and we can use our education system to do that. Here, they use a standard curriculum, creating a state-sponsored culture, and we actually do the same thing in our world. All countries do this for their own reasons. And lastly, it says that this push for cultural unity push other parts of the empire to want to break away. You can do all you want to force different people to believe in certain things, but this is actually going to only want to push other regions farther away. We see this even today in China, as China has a huge group of Muslims that they persecute called the Uyghurs. And all the more that the Chinese arrest the Uyghurs and the Chinese persecute the Uyghurs, it's going to create some Uyghurs to want independence. It's going to want them independence. In our own country, the United States, as the North wanted to push their influence on the South, it didn't bring the South closer to the values of the North. It actually led to regionalism, pushing the South away. And we're going to see that happening as well in the days and weeks to come as the Ottoman Empire continues to live up to its name of the sick man of Europe. So to summarize, what we've seen today is that this word nationalism helps to bring countries together that had never been together. Countries like Italy, countries like Germany, they're together for the first time, and they have global consequences. Germany, united under the leadership of Prussia, becomes more and more a world power, even able to invade and beat up France in a single year, the Franco-Prussian War. Italy being brought together, it's going to want to become a world power, but it's going to also create a culture and a climate where millions of Italians leave Italy to places like the United States and Argentina. And we also see that that same nationalism that unites countries also threatens to tear parts of the world apart, like the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, like the, even later we'll see the Austrian Empire. All those different areas inspired by Enlightenment thinking are going to be recipes for empires to be torn apart. And that's going to actually lead us more and more to the events of things like World War I. With that, we'll look at transitioning our time from political revolutions to economic revolutions. And next week, we'll be looking at the economic system people love or people hate. And that is capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. I look forward to spending that time with you guys then. Until then, stay safe. Thank you all very much.